On behalf of the Harper family, I'd like to welcome Lieutenant Scallon to come. For those of you who don't know, he's from Wexford, is that correct? And there's quite a sporting rivalry between Kilkenny and Wexford. But he very graciously said he'd come and talk to such a Kilkenny organisation. But we all have a Wexford granny, so a bit like the Irish football team, we can claim a little bit to Wexford.
Thank you.
So I'll hand you over to him and lead on in. He will talk for probably
45 minutes.
40, half an hour, 45 minutes, and you can and be questions at the end of it, and then we'll go to lunch. Afterwards, we'll go to the barracks, but I'll give a few details on that when he's finished. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to work up that?
Yeah, thanks very much. Okay. It's just afternoon now, so I'll say good afternoon to everybody. I'd like to thank Edwin and Jill particularly for inviting me here to talk today. It fell out of a visit to the Barracks Museum from Edwin last year when he had a discharge paper for the gentleman we're going to talk about today, Robert, and how to decipher that or where to find some information in relation to that. Now it's not easy because militia service in Ireland wasn't very well documented, particularly on the foundation. But in order to give you the context in which he served, I must first outline to you how the Militia of Ireland was formed, and then we'll get into how Robert ended up in the militia, his military service, how he ended up in Kilkenny, and then I'll finish up by just telling you how the militia evolved until it was disbanded in 1922, just to set the whole context of the Irish militia and how important it has been in our military heritage, because, and quite often, in most cases, well forgotten. Okay, so the introduction. Heritage. What is heritage? Our heritage is very joined. Even though you and I are not related, we now share heritage. We share military heritage. And heritage, unlike history, history is very scientific. To me, our heritage is like you taking ownership of part of your history, and then that you have inherited from your ancestors, and how that now it's your responsibility to make sure that your descendants in the next 100 years still remember that Robert had a military heritage, and within that context, that's and it's the same for agricultural heritage or industrial heritage. It's not the whole of your history, but it's the important parts that you feel you need to pass on to your descendants. So anyway, why did we end up with an Irish militia? In 1793, the Napoleonic Wars kicked off, and George III here on your left and Napoleon on the right, the war started. And George discovered that in Ireland there weren't enough troops. Bearing in mind now, Ireland still had its own independent parliament, and he couldn't, by virtue, he couldn't just ordain that they would have create a new army. But what he then obviously discovered was that I don't have enough eligible soldiers to fill this new militia I want to form, because at that current time you had to be of the Protestant faith or Church of England, Church of Ireland faith in order to carry arms. So 1793 is a very important time because it is when George III brought out legislation or law which allowed Catholics to carry arms for the first time since the penal laws were introduced. So why did he need to do it? Well, you can see that the French Empire was quite big, and off on its lonesome there on the western, or the very here, we have the United Kingdom of England and Ireland, as it would become in 1800 anyway. And the big threat was that the French were going to invade via the west coast of Ireland, because England, the United Kingdom, was so well defended by forts and so on and so forth, and massive amount of troops, that the soft underbelly was seen to be Ireland. So George III needed a new army. And how did he do that? Well, he used his political leaders, William Pitt the Younger, who was the Prime Minister, and John Fane, then Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. They helped to push through Ireland the new Act, which was called 33, which is the 33rd year of George III's reign, Chapter 22. And the main sponsor of the Militia Bill was Lord Hillsborough, and also many other of the very important people throughout the country, like the Duke of Ormond here, and other very strong political leaders throughout the country. So from 1793, we now have a militia formed. So what formation did it take? Well, it had 38 regiments. Every county in Ireland had at least one regiment, and some counties had more. Like Down had a North Down and South Down. Dublin had 2 militias. But after they were embodied, the Kilkenny Militia, the 20th Kilkenny Militia, were given that order of precedence, because in the army you can't have everybody as important as each other. Somebody has to be the senior man. So what they done with the regiments of militia was that all the commanders got together in Dublin, they put 38 numbers into a hat and they pulled them out by ballot. So whoever got the number 1, which happened to be the Monaghan Militia, they became the senior regiment of Irish militia. So Kilkenny are somewhere around the middle. And they happen to be the 20th Militia Regiment, and unfortunately for me, the whole junior regiment in the whole of the country was Wexford, the 38th Wexford Militia. So there you can see we now have 38 regiments of militia formed in Ireland, and their function was, first of all, foremost, they were only going to be embodied for 1 month a year. They would train like we would remember FCA men here, if any of you have FCA service. You come in, you get into uniform as a temporary soldier, but that didn't happen. From the date of embodiment, they stayed on active service until 1802, when they were stood down for a short period after the Treaty of Amiens, and then they were re-embodied in 1803, and we'll talk about that in a minute, when they were then on active service from 1803 till 1816 without break. So here were the military commanders in Kilkenny, the Earl of Ormond, I should say, and his son. They would be the first commanders of the Kilkenny Militia circa 1793. So what sort of structure did it have? The Kilkenny Regiment, like all regiments, had an officer corps and an enlisted men's corps. So the officer corps, where you had one commandant, the boss, you had a lieutenant colonel, major, captains, a captain lieutenant who was the senior lieutenant, you had lieutenants, you had ensigns, which would be junior lieutenants, you had a chaplain, adjutant, quartermaster, surgeon, and the Kilkenny Militia's uniform from day one was a red, scarlet red uniform with yellow facings. The cuffs were yellow and the collars were yellow. The breeches was white, and by the way, just in case you're, I can give this PowerPoint to anybody that wants it at the end, so it's a freebie. And so very similar to what this gentleman looks like here would have been how the Kilkenny Militia soldiers would have looked circa 1793. So how could you become an officer in the militia? Well, you had to own land. You had to be wealthy. So in fact, it was set in such a way that only the wealthiest man in the county could be the commander of the regiment. So it happened being the Duke of Ormond here, or the Earl of Ormond as he was at the time. So you had to have a net worth of £2,000, or you had to have an heir, be the heir to at least £3,000. Now these were significant sums of money in 1793. So to be the lieutenant colonel, you must be worth £1,600 sterling, or have an heir to a daddy that was worth £1,800 euros were not mentioned. The major, to be a major, you had to have £300, a captain £200, a lieutenant had to have an independent worth of £50, or an ensign, a second lieutenant, had to have at least £20 worth himself, or be the son of a person who was worth £250. So you could see here that without doubt all of the officer corps were Church of Ireland, Church of England, or they weren't the Catholic soldiers, because very few, if any, of the Catholic population at that time would have had a net value of any of those sums of money there. So who were they? So in Kilkenny, I don't know how familiar these names, they were not familiar to me when I started doing the research, but you can see looking through it that they are some very strong Kilkenny names still. So the first colonel was the Earl of Ormond and Ossory, and he held that commission from 1793. And all these officers, and why I've shown these names is, these are the officer corps that were in situation when Robert Harper joined the Kilkenny Militia. Nicholas Loftus and John Henry, I think they pronounce it, were the lieutenant colonels. And when we look at the discharge papers at the very end, it's this same John Henry that signs off on his discharge in 1825. You have Henry Wims, William Izod, Murphy, Hemmings, the Helsam, an F sometimes replaces an S, so that's Helsam, Matthews, Butler, Loftus, Waring, Waring, and there's all the lieutenants. Right through there, you can check that out later on. And here we have the ensigns, and an important man here as well for us is the adjutant John Gordon, because he's actually the adjutant that signs his discharge papers in 1825. So, the Kilkenny Orbat, who were the soldiers, right? Well, a company was made up of 4 sergeants, 5 corporals, 65 privates, and they had 8 of those companies. They had 2 drummers, 2 staff sergeants, 2 pipers, and 26 plus officers. The officers were seldom with their regiment because every officer usually had some official business at home that caused them to be away from the regiment. So in other words, if you had 26 or 34 officers with the regiment, maybe 6 would be with the regiment and the rest would be at home looking after the farm, the estate, their political activities, so on and so forth. So the officer corps tended to go up and down. And we will see in a few minutes that Robert very quickly ended up being a sergeant, which was the senior NCO rank in the militia company. Now, okay, so just to give you an idea, and this is 1796, we haven't yet moved on, you'll just see that the militia, first of all, were never stationed in their home county. That was gone. They were moved out of their county after about 6 months and never returned to their home county until 1816, if you stayed in service. So this is just to show you here, and when you get the presentation later, you can look at it in more detail. The Irish militia were dotted all over, mostly though, I would say, in the Munster area and certainly in the Ulster area. And it seems, from my research, that the Kilkenny militia spent a very substantial part of their embodied life in Ulster, or at least in the border counties. Sometime in Cork, sometime in Laois, but mostly up towards the northern part of the country. So what was their first action? The Kilkenny militia and every other militia regiment in Ireland, their very first live situation was the United Irishman Rebellion in 1798. And everybody remembers, if we're all taught history, everybody's taught that the 1798 rebellion was defeated by the Crown forces. Well, they were, but they weren't Englishmen. They were all Irishmen, or at least 68% of the soldiers who fought the United Irishmen during the insurrection in 1798, particularly in my home county, in Escarty and New Ross and Owlert and even Gore's Bridge here in Kilkenny and up into Limerick, up into Kildare, even into the north of Ireland. The United Irishmen were, for the most part, the insurrection was suppressed by Irishmen. So in effect, you could say that the 1798 rebellion was almost a civil war, in that it was Irishman fighting Irishman. There's typical uniforms of the 1798 time of the militia regiments. You'll see here the red yellow facings here, typical of a Kilkenny soldier here. So there you can see, in 1798 you had 22,000 militia, 10,000 fencibles and only 1,830 soldiers from the mainland UK. So the whole United Irishman Rebellion was suppressed and put down by Irish militia. These were Irishmen, mostly of Catholic faith and some Church of Ireland. For instance, the Kilkenny militia had a ratio of 7 Catholics to 2 Church of Ireland or Protestant faith. Other militia regiments varied. The North Cork were almost extensively Church of Ireland or Church of England. It's hard to, that was because that their boss had allocated every soldier a plot of 20 acres for joining up the militia. That was highly unusual, and subsequently the entire regiment, which were wiped out, by the way, on Owlert Hill during the 1798 insurrection. But the Battle of New Ross is the main place where the Kilkenny militia fought, and it was due to their actions that New Ross was one of the bloodiest battles of the whole 1798 rebellion, and the Kilkennys had a very large part in suppressing and looking after the defence of New Ross. And there were over 100,000 people killed in the 1798 rebellion. It was no small event in Ireland, and totally sort of, we all liked the 1798 and we run around with our pikes, and I did that when Offaly Betis in 1998. I was going to have a great year, but that didn't happen. but that's it. But you know, 100,000 people is no insignificant number, and it was Irishmen and Irishmen. Anyway, the Kilkennys again were involved later on in the year when in Castlebar, and we've all heard of the Castlebar races, which has gotten very bad press over the years because the commander, a British aristocrat, made a mistake, and he blamed Who did he blame? He blamed the Kilkenny Militia. We all remember the race of Castlebar, the year of the French. Years ago we saw the film where the militias ran. Well, they didn't. What happened was that General Lake gave a command for a retrograde movement, in other words, a withdrawal under fire, and the Kilkenny Militia had marched 50 miles the day before to get to their position on the front line. They were the front line, and they had worked as detachments, and I'll talk to you about that in a few minutes. They had never practiced this manoeuvre before, even in peacetime, and this guy and the Earl of Ormond said, no, we can't do it, we're going to hold our position, and he was overruled by General, and they withdrew, but the withdrawal became a rout, and they didn't know how to withdraw under fire, so it did turn into a non-tactical withdrawal, and the blame was soundly placed on the militia and defensible regiments which were on the line, but really it was the general in charge who made a bum call. But you know, you never blame yourself, do you? Somebody lower, and that's why I quite often get the blame for things, because I'm at the lower end of the food chain. Okay, so 1802, and we're getting in close to the time now, which is really important for us. So in 1802 there was a temporary peace between England and France. They signed a treaty called the Amiens Treaty, and at that time all the defensible regiments were disbanded completely, and militia regiments were put into suspended animation. They were disembodied, in other words, they were all sent home, and they went home to their home counties. But it quickly started again. The peace was short-lived, and the 15th of March 1803 the militia were re-embodied by offering a bounty of 2 guineas paid for any recently retired militiaman who would re-enlist. Now 2 guineas is a substantial sum of money to a guy who would be working mostly as a labourer or as a non-technical person out there in 17 or 1803. So quite a few, it quickly refilled. But what happened was, in 1805 there were 2 acts passed by George. We call him George, you should call him King George, but anyway. George III, he authorised the acceptance of Irish militiamen into service of Great Britain and line regiments. In other words, your 1st Regiment of Foot, your 2nd Regiment of Foot. And then he also, and this is very important for us, he also passed a law for augmentation of the militiamen of Ireland. So we've already discovered that there was 608 militiamen in a Kilkenny regiment because it had 8 companies. Well, what he allowed for was that would go up to 100 men per company, but that company must supply 15 men per year for foreign service. So this is where we come to a thing called augmentation. So we come now to the end of 1805. The Kilkennys were stationed not in Kilkenny, they were outside their home county, and we come to the stage where we now find Robert Harper working, for my research, and I'll in a minute, in Strabane, he found himself listening, probably doing some mundane work one day, and there was a drum beating outside, and a few guys finally laid out in their uniforms, and it was a recruitment party for the Kilkenny Militia up in Tyrone. And he said, he was 36 years of age, I'd say. He had a family, as we know. And he said, I've had enough of this. They're offering me 5 guineas now. I get 5 guineas tomorrow if I join the militia. So on the 27th of December, 1805, Robert decided, I'm going to have some of this money and maybe look after the family a little bit. And he joined up. And that's all deducted from his papers here. And I'll go through it now. He was from, we would imagine, this parish here, Occavay, County Fermanagh. The Church of Ireland church in Occavay is built in 1800, so this is probably where he went to church. That's just his crest, the county crest on the right-hand side there with the diagonal cross of St. Patrick, which is kind of important because post-Union, post-1800, Ireland was represented on the Union flag by the diagonal cross of St. Patrick, and it still is. If you're from the Northern Unionist tradition, it would still, and even if you're Northern Republican tradition, it still represents you because you're in the United Kingdom. So Occavay, County Fermanagh, was where he was born, and near Buckborough estate, or around that land, town's land, and that is on his discharge papers, okay? And these are, what's on the discharge papers are only copies of what was taken on his enlistment forms, which you probably don't have and won't have. So his employment on discharge is not soldier, it's whatever he left when he joined up in 1805, okay? So we're move on. So he joined the militia in Strabane in County Tyrone, and he enlisted on the 27th of December 1805. And I'll just draw, this is my unit crest, the 3rd Battalion. We're the garrison regiment down in Kilkenny, and we, since we were founded in 1922, have had the red hand of Ulster as our symbol. And it just so happens that I share another piece of heritage with Robert, because he joined the militia in 1805, coming from a county which used the red hand of Ulster as its symbol as well. So here we go, right, just to give you proof. So I've taken from his discharge papers, and if you look here, this is S-T-R-A-B-A-N-E, Strabane. Okay, so that is exactly where he joined the militia. Strabane is 50 miles from Brookborough in County Fermanagh, so it is I would contend that he wasn't there for a day visit. You know, he probably left where he came from for employment, and that he was working in Strabane at some task. Now, I don't know, but I'm just making assumptions, and that out of this beautiful looking band that banged their way through the town that fine day, the 27th of December 1805, he said, well, I've enough of this. Whatever he was banging to making or doing, whatever his employment was, he wanted out, and he joined the militia. So here we have his statement of service, and I just go through this briefly. You can see here that, beg your pardon, no, too quick. He joined the Kilkenny Militia the 27th of December 1805, and he stayed in until the 24th of April 1825. Okay, that's all we need to get now, because I'm going to go through the rest of it. Here we have his service as a private soldier. This is a uniform of a private soldier from the Kilkenny Militia, dated circa 1805, 1806. If any of you have one of those in your wardrobe at home, I'd gladly take it for the museum. But we can see that Robert only spent 1 year, 317 days as a private soldier. That to me tells me one thing. First of all, we know that he was older than most of his guys that he was 36 joining the militia, and we'll go through that again a little later. But he certainly was educated, because you don't get promoted unless you can read and write and all the usual things, and that it is a very short time frame to be a private soldier in the militia at that time. So he entered the militia as an augmented soldier, when some of his buddies then, or people in the militia, would have been volunteering for the line. So they would have gone off with regiments to fight wherever. It was in the Peninsular War at the time. They were probably sent to Spain. But he maintained his militia service throughout his time. So here we have then, so he quickly moved up the ranks. So we can see here then he spent from 1807 to 1809 as a corporal. And he spent a total of 1 year, 278 days as a corporal. And he then made the rank of sergeant. And he held the rank of sergeant from his time in 1809 till 1825, when he retired, when he was discharged from the militia. You can see here a picture of a sergeant's uniform with his spontoon, which is a pike-like device, and the sergeant's job was, as well as other things, was to defend the colours. And the colours that Robert would have defended, or if he had needed, or would have cared for, are now currently hanging in the visitor centre in Stephen's Barracks. And any of you that do take the time to come down here this afternoon will actually see the very colours that he would have held in his hands. And now that's a piece of heritage. Okay, so, and again, if you have that uniform at home, I'll take that as well. Okay, so what did the sergeant do? So I've just taken from the standing orders. Now the sergeant has a lot of stuff to do, but I just thought that these were unique enough. They are to be vigilant, active, lively and trustworthy. They will enforce these orders and thereby establish regularity and uniformity in their soldiers. They are to treat the men with mildness and good humour when they behave well, and will punish the idle and negligent impartially. They will then, when on duty, treat their men with rigour if their behaviour requires it. So a sergeant's job, and very much like Robert, and I didn't say this at the start, my military career would mirror his again, because I did join the Defence Forces as a private soldier. I was a corporal, I was a sergeant, and I did get commissioned okay in 2007, 2008. But I would have done all that stuff. That job description there didn't change in 200 years. That was my job as a sergeant back in the middle of the last decade. And like a sergeant's role was to be the mammy and daddy to the men, kinda, you know, because they had nobody else to crib to. The corporals wouldn't really listen. They had their own jobs to do. So the sergeant looked after pay, he looked after their welfare, because half the time the officer wasn't there. He was off at home cutting the hay or whatever had to be done, or calf and whatever had to be done, that he was making the big bucks at home. And so the sergeant was left in charge. So Robert would have had approximately 30 soldiers with his corporals to look after all the time, 24/7, 7 days a week. So what was the job? What was their job? What were they doing in 1805 right through? Well, we'll call it interior economy. What was their function? Well, their main functions were policing roles. Because the militia, there was no established constabulary in Ireland back in the start of the 19th century, that this function was completely filled by militiamen. So the militia company would have been broken down maybe into 4 or 5 detachments of 15 men, and they would be placed in villages and towns around the county that they were in. And they would have been responsible for mail coach escorts, prisoner escorts, Coast Guard employment, bailiff protection, collection of taxes, obviously, evictions, illicit still detection and disposal. A big one back in the day. So there was a lot of that going on up in the north. I say it's still going on somewhere, but it was a big deal for the militia. Why? Because his daily pay, the daily pay was 1 shilling 6 3/4 D for a sergeant. So he had 7 shillings, and you can make the rest of it if you know what old money was. He had about 10.5 shillings a week. But if he was in charge of a detachment of soldiers that found a still with a head and worm, he would be given a bounty of 11 shillings 4.5 D. So that was nice money. That was over a week's wages for the apprehension of a still. Now, these stills were well defended by the guys that were brewing or stilling the illicit alcohol, because, you know, we didn't have a Jameson, or we didn't have anywhere to go to buy proper branded whiskey or anything at the time. These boys were supplying the Irish culture, which never changed, from their alcoholic beverages, and they were quite important. But if he did that, and his corporal would get 5 shillings and his privates would get 3 shillings for the denying the use of a still head and worm to the local population. But as well as that, if he was on an escort duty and he marched up to 15 miles, he would get an allowance of 1 shilling and 1 penny. But if he marched above 156 miles on a single journey, which they often did, you go from Tyrone to Dublin with prisoners, you have a round journey there, and he would get an allowance of 8 shillings 1.5 D for that journey. The militia soldier travelled nowhere only on his feet. They would travel upwards of 20 miles a day, walking, and that was routine. And you'll see in a few minutes why he discharged out of the militia, and you won't wonder why when we tell you. So there you see a typical sergeant defending his colours, just to give you an idea of what they looked like and what they did. So then we'll move on. Robert was totally involved with his regiment and doing all the duties of that nature, mostly around the north of Ireland, the whole Tyrone, Strabane, Monaghan area. It's very difficult and patchy to find exact records of where they were at a given time, but we do know that in 1811, George III, again, enacted a law which allowed militias to interchange. In other words, militia regiments from England could come to Ireland, and they would be swapped over from an Irish militia regiment who would go to England. So that happened in 1811. 14 regiments went, and they were swapped over after 2 years. And in 1813, the Kilkenny militia, along with the Antrim, the North Down, the Longfords, the Londonderry Militia, Louth, Monaghan, South Down, to mention some of 16 regiments, all went in 1813 to the mainland United Kingdom, and they were replaced in Ireland by English militia regiments. It says that the Kilkennys had a festive 6 weeks before they departed from Dublin. I'm not going to suggest what they done during their festivities. A few ladies' hearts were broke. Now, I know Robert was married at that stage and he wouldn't have any of that, but that's just some of the records. And from that time then, the Kilkennys are then in 1813, they're in Liverpool. And Liverpool then is the 2nd biggest port in the world. So the majority of all imports coming into Liverpool and into the UK and leaving were coming in through Liverpool. So there was a heavy requirement for security and that sort of stuff. So the Kilkennys were involved there for a long period of time, number of months, securing Liverpool port and ensuring its safety and security. So there's about 800 of them, and all their wives and children went with them. So we'll see in a few minutes that Robert, who had already married from some of the records and had children at that stage, would have been entitled to bring his family with them. Now, because his family travelled with them, he wouldn't have been entitled to an allowance for their uptake. However, had they stayed at home, they would have been paid an allowance out of the parish cess. There was a collection made annually from the people in the parish, and that money was paid to the dependents of militiamen who stayed at home. But once they travelled with their husbands, then they had no entitlement to an allowance. So Robert had to pay for him, upkeep his family out of his salary as a sergeant. So after that, then they were moved to Nottingham, where they put down the riots called the Luddite riots. And these riots happened when, I suppose, the Industrial Revolution was happening now, and machinery was replacing skilled labourers, people who would have manufactured garments and that, and now they found that there was machines doing these things, and that didn't go down well in England, and there was a thing called the Luddite riots, and the Kilkennys were sent to Nottingham to quell the riots that were happening in Nottingham. Now, the people of Nottingham didn't like the Kilkennys because they were good at their job, okay? And this is well recorded in a magistrate's court in London, when the officer commanding of the Kilkennys was highly commended for the conduct of his soldiers during the recent disturbance in Nottingham. And the magistrate goes on to say that he does understand that the private soldiers of the Kilkenny regiment were put under severe strain by the local population, in that they were verbally abused at every opportunity, and they were very restrained in that they didn't, you know, take physical action against the people who, the Luddite rebellion or whatever was going on in the UK. So we do know that happened, and that was probably around the start of 1814. So Robert was there, and the family would have followed in a trail behind the regiment when they moved, and they moved everywhere on foot, by the way. So after that, then they moved from Liverpool to Nottingham down to Harwich, and in Harwich, which is a coastal on the east coast, so they marched across the full UK. They were located in Harwich at the end of 1813 into 1814, and it's here now that we start to get a record, potentially, of Robert being on a parish record, because in a place called Wheely, which was a barracks built in 1802 and disbanded in 1820 because the war was over with Napoleon, but there is a record of, on the 28th of April 1814, a Jane Harper being born to Robert and Elizabeth Harper in Wheely Barracks, and he's listed as being a sergeant in the Kilkenny Militia. Now, law of averages, there's no more than one Robert Harper, and he married, his wife was a girl called Jane. I actually don't know that the ancestry of the family, that wasn't part of my remit, but I would assume that this is the Sergeant Harper that we're talking about now. Okay, so what happened then? So we have an eyewitness then to an event that happened in June in 1814, because Napoleon was sent to Elba. Erbil was I saw Elba, and the boys decided, the bigwigs in England, that we'll celebrate and we'll have a review in Portsmouth. And Jane Austen writes to a friend of hers, Cassandra, in London, telling her to take care of herself on the roads. It's going to be very busy. That General Blucher, the Duke of Wellington, are to be welcomed by the Prince Regent to Portsmouth. With Napoleon in Elba, the Allied leaders thought they could relax and decided to visit England to see the British Navy and militia at work. And it so happened then that the Kilkenny Militia formed a major part of this review. And General Blucher, along with the Duke of Wellington, was so impressed with the smartness of the Kilkenny regiment that he offered them 400 places in his army there and then. And the Kilkenny Militia volunteered 370, but because they didn't reach the required quota of 400, the offer wasn't taken up. If that offer had been taken up, the Kilkenny Militia would have been the only Irish regiment, barred the 27th Regiment of Foot, the Enniskillens, or the only militia regiment to have been at Waterloo. But it didn't happen because they were 30 short of the required quota. So just to show you the smartness of the Kilkenny Militia at the time, this is a Kilkenny Militia bandsman, and this uniform is still on display in the National Museum in Dublin. They won't give it to me. It's a Kilkenny bandsman, a trumpeter from around the time. So you can, the Earl of Ormond spent £1,500 a year on his band. Now that's big money. You put that into today's monetary value. He was very proud of his band, and the whole style and the deportment of the regiment would have been really the responsibility of sergeants. They're the people who instill deportment and style and stuff. So Robert, I'm sure, would have been very proud of his time, and the fact that General Blucher, now General Blucher was a bit senile and all that sort of stuff, and that's another day's work. I'm not going to get into that, right? But he did so prove to be the saviour of Waterloo the following year, when his column actually tipped the balance in favour of the Duke of Wellington, and where Napoleon did meet his Waterloo. So then we move on to 1816. The regiment was withdrawn from the UK and the war was over. Napoleon was gone. So then they decided, well, if we've no Napoleon and we've no war, we don't need to pay a militia. So they decided to disembody the militia. But the militia regiments could only be disembodied in their home county. Not the county of the soldiers, the county of the colonel. So that's how Robert ended up in Kilkenny. No other reason. He had to come back to Kilkenny to get his last few bob for the disbanding of the regiment. But here's the thing. Robert must have been very effective at his job, because he was one of a very small number of soldiers who were retained as a cadre staff. In other words, if the militia was going to be re-embodied again, let's say a war did break out again, and the militia was to be re-embodied, then they would need a cadre, a permanent staff who would now be in a position to train the new soldiers. You have to retain that. It is said at the disembodiment of the Kilkenny, there were such well regard for the officers in the regiment that each and every officer of the regiment was carried around Kilkenny City on a chair over the soldiers' heads, and that's well recorded, and it is in some of the books that I've read there in relation to it. So there was a very good rapport between the officers of the Kilkenny Militia and certainly their soldiers, and it's the only regiment in Ireland where any record like that is there. So then Robert would have found himself as a cadre soldier, but with no permanent pay, because you were only paid for when you came into work. I'm going to make an assumption now that he was well regarded by one of his officers, and that officer would have made available to him a plot of land. And we know that he settled in Coon, and that maybe that's how it happened. I don't know. I don't know for certain. His cadre staff, as here, this is an old picture of Kilkenny Barracks, and hopefully some of you will come in and see it this afternoon. This is exactly what he would have seen. This is taken in 1900. The barracks was built in 1801 through 1803, and it didn't change a jot until, I suppose, the end of the 20th century, when it did get a bit of renovation. So what that picture there is exactly, except probably the paraffin lamp, okay, wasn't there when Robert was around. But other than that, you're looking at what he saw. The barracks was built by Mr. Switzer. He was a local philanthropist, and the stone left over from the building of the barracks was used to build Switzer's Asylum, which is across the road from the Castle Park. So his discharge. Is it any wonder? Robert was discharged because his right knee was kaput. And he had varicose veins. Now, if you're walking 20 miles a day, I would suggest to you that you have varicose veins yourself. Bearing in mind, his footwear weren't what we were wearing now. Okay? And he's signed out, the surgeon who discharged him is Robert Gillespie, surgeon. He signed his discharge. And because he was discharged on medical grounds, that may have also, and I don't know for certain, given him the possibility of a disability pension of some type of payment for the rest of his life, because he wasn't discharged for being unfit for service. Or he was unfit for service, but it wasn't his fault. Do you know what I mean? It was wear and tear on his body. But his conduct is assessed as being good, and that there is probably one of the reasons why he was offered cadre service. It was very hard to get a conduct rating of good in those days. They weren't handed out like they are now. Okay, so we can see here that Robert Harper hereby acknowledge that I have received all my entitlements. And John Gordon, remember I mentioned John Gordon at the start? Well, there's John Gordon's signature. And here is Robert Harper's own signature back in 1825. Robert Harper, Sergeant. And he quite good writing. I mean, that's not print, that's proper handwriting. You know what I'm saying? It is the sign of an educated man. His handwriting is as good as his officers, basically. And it says that he was 5 feet 8 inches tall, which is 1.5 inches above the average height of a soldier in that time, a militia soldier. And bearing in mind that Robert is 56, retiring, he has probably lost a bit of height in that time. So he probably entered maybe even at 5'10", 5'9". So he was of good stature. So it's no surprise to me today when I walk in here and I see loads of 6 foot tall gentlemen. Because the gene has come down, and because I would also make an assumption here and now that he was well fed in his early life, because he grew to that stature. If you were suffered from malnutrition, as lots of people did back in the end of the 18th century, you would have attained a height of 5'6", 5'5", which was very normal. And actually the normal height of a militia soldier in that time was around 5'5". So you can make assumptions from that one piece of paper that is his discharge paper, and I would assume that his parents were, if not well off, at least had a standard of living which allowed him to develop as a fine specimen of a man, basically, is what I'm saying. Okay, he had dark hair, and there's lots of dark hair out there, and he had grey eyes. I don't know if grey eyes are still a tribute of the Harper clan, right? But that's what he had. And he was given his occupation, and his occupation was what he joined as, and his occupation is given as labourer. And that is very normal. The general militia volunteer in that time was a person who was not connected with land. If you had any connection with land, you would not give up your piece of land to become a militia soldier. You're a labourer or an engineer. An engineer wasn't somebody who built something. An engineer was a manual person who was able to use a machine. You were much more likely to become a militia soldier, and it is no surprise to me at all that his occupation is given as a labourer. So you can see that Henry is the lieutenant colonel who signed them out, Colonel Kilkenny Militia, and we saw him at the start. He was then the lieutenant colonel. He's now got an old promotion for himself. He's the colonel. Fair play to him. And that then sort of 1825. Robert resigns or retires from the militia, and he becomes a private citizen. And he disappears off the record then in relation to military life. Except that I was only shown this morning here when I came in, his grandson had a long distinguished career of 2 weeks when he obviously ran away from home, and he joined the 13th Regiment of Foot, who were then stationed in Kilkenny Barracks. And obviously his dad found out and was very unhappy and paid the princely sum of £20 to get him back out, which back in the day was a lot of money. But what happened to the militia? So Robert's finished. So just to give you the final context of it all, the militia stayed in suspended animation. Like Robert, the guys who were on cadre service retired, died, and they were never replaced. Until 1854, when we had the Crimean War, which really was a strategic war between France, Britain and Russia regarding their interests in Eastern Europe and down into India. And we know that the Crimean War was mostly fought on the Crimean Peninsula, Sevastopol, places like that. And it is where the Kilkenny Militia were now redesignated the Kilkenny Fusilier Militia. And this is a uniform. I beg your pardon. This is the uniform, and typically this is a gentleman, not a Kilkenny militiaman now, but this is exactly how they would have looked in the Crimean War. The Crimean War is well remembered as being a war that the generals, 90% of the British soldiers that died in the Crimean War died of starvation and neglect. Their officers had no ability to develop logistic support to guys who are now feeling the blunt end of the Industrial Revolution, whereby weapons were now so accurate that they had to dig holes to live. So this was really a precursor to what would come along in the First World War. But the generals hadn't the concept. Lord Raglan, Lucan, Cardigan and the charge of the Light Brigade, seen as being a massively successful attack, which it was, but based on stupidity, to be honest. And post the Crimean War, a fellow called Lord Cardwell decided that he was going to redesign the army, and we came up with the concept of the 1881 reforms, where the Kilkenny Militia became a militia battalion, the 5th Militia Battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment, the 18th Regiment of Foot. Cardwell designed the concept where that every regiment would be territorialised with a part of the country. or the United Kingdom, and the southeast of Ireland was the 18th Regiment of Foot. The Munster Fusiliers would have been territorialised into Cork, Limerick, Kerry, that sort of area, the Connacht Rangers, so on and so forth. So the militia became the 5th Militia Battalion, the Royal Irish Regiment, and then they were re-embodied again for the Boer War, where this Kilkenny gentleman here, Private John Barry, I wish now that he was John Harper, but he's not, I don't have another story. Private John Barry was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions carried out on the 7th and 8th of January 1901 on a place called Monument Hill in Belfast, South Africa, where he defended his machine gun position, losing his life, making sure that the machine gun was disabled so that the Boers couldn't turn it on his comrades. And this act was witnessed by his commanding officer, and he was written up, and he was one of the first recipients of a posthumous VC, Kilkenny man from the Boer War. So then there was another reform in 1908, and the 5th Militia Battalion became the 4th Special Reserve Battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment, and it is this regiment that went off and fought with the 2 permanent battalions, the 1st and 2nd Battalion, during the First World War. In fact, most of the Kilkenny militia soldiers were brought up for active service in August 1914, and in one particular battle in a place called Lepilly on the 19th and 20th of October 1914, of over 800 soldiers which were on the roll books on the 19th of October, only 73 were left on the 20th of October. When the German assault surrounded their position and decimated the regiment, lots of the soldiers were killed, many more were wounded, and the rest of them were POWs for the duration of the war. So there has been significant military service given by the Kilkenny Militia in all its formations throughout the centuries. In 1922, Michael Collins negotiated the treaty with the authorities in the UK, and falling out of that was the disbanding of the 7 Irish regiments. So the Kilkenny Militia ceased to exist in July 1922, when the regimental colours of its parent regiment were handed over to the King in the UK, and there they remain to this day on public display in Westminster. There you see, typically, if you have one of these, I'll take it as well. It's a belt plate of the Kilkenny Militia, KM, Kilkenny Militia, with the cross or with the crown of George Rex, King George III. Very, very unique items. Sergeants may have had them. More often, the officers had them. And this is just one of the North Mayos as well. Now, again, I have a few bits and pieces. You might see them in the afternoon if you come in to me. So my bibliography, where did I get this information from, just to finish up? The books are there listed. I didn't take it out of the sky. Everything I've said to you is based in solid fact, which I researched, and it was a very enjoyable research period, I have to say. But if you do, and they will be with the PowerPoint if you get them off me later on, there are another number of sources, but they're the main contexts from where we get our information. Just to finish up, I can only find one Harper officer who was with the militia, and it was a Scottish militia regiment in 1809. That's when I took my snapshot. So you will see that there is a George Harper who was commissioned on the 25th of February 1806 with the Renfrew militia in Scotland. There you go. That concludes my discussion and talk on the Kilkenny militia. Now, I'll open to the floor, and you'll shoot me down, I've no doubt, in a second. Has anybody any questions that they'd like me to endeavour to answer?
Yes, I just have one. I'm just interested. I'm just interested. When Robert Harper went to England, he brought his wife and family. Now, is there any possibility that some of that family could have married and stayed in England? And could he have brought his wife and his younger children back to Ireland?
He was there 2 years.
Oh, he was, okay.
2 years.
Okay,
1813 to 1815.
Okay.
And I think the oldest record, now I was only talking to a gentleman here earlier, and I think his eldest son was born in 1810. Okay. So there's no possibility at all.
Okay, that's fine.
All right?
No, the link with the army is interesting, and it's in the family and other places. And there was an Alec Thompson, for instance, who was in the First World War. grew up in Dublin, but in the Harpers across in Canada, I found Harpers signing up for the Canadian forces in 1914. So the military link is there.
And that's very typical. I have one particular gentleman, his name is Nicholas Welch. He was a regimental sergeant major with the 8th Battalion, the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Lots of Irish guys who had emigrated to get a new life. When the First War started, they just re-enlisted or joined up, and they were very... Look, I'll put it this way. In Ireland, we were subject of British authority or power for 800 years. Now, I would contend that we were governed by power, not authority, because it just wasn't in our nature. But within that, like, you can't be in a union for over 100 years and not have a connection with the country. So there was a lot of Irish people who were very loyal citizens of the United Kingdom. And that's how come that we have, like, that man in Canada didn't need to come and fight a war. He had a new life. So did Nicholas Welch, you know. And these guys felt such a connection with what was going on. Maybe a little bit of it was propaganda, I don't know. But they were still that closely connected with the country that we were, United Kingdom at the time, that they had no problem leaving Canada, Australia, New Zealand, America, to come back and fight in what was the destruction that is France and Flanders, do you know? But it is, and I firmly believe that there's not one person in this room that hasn't an ancestor that stood in the trench, or at least was very closely related to somebody that was either on active service in the First War, the Great War, and you know, did or didn't come back. And if they did come back, they couldn't relate to anybody their experience because they weren't allowed, because 1916 had happened and it became a completely different political environment here.
I think the aggression is still in some. I was looking at the emails before the reunion, and somebody had said they had booked flights to come to Ireland. They left out the letter L just.
Okay, I'll take two more before we go to lunch.
Just coming back to 1798, you said that only Protestants could carry arms.
Yeah, so
I'm just wondering how the United Irishmen managed to wage such such a war against the militiamen, given that background of non-conflict and no war.
I'll endeavour to answer that question because I'm not an expert on it. In 1793 is when the law changed. So you had 5 years between 1793 and 1798. The initial contract for a militiaman was 5 years. So quite a few guys who had been in the militia and left crossed over to the United Irishmen's side. But don't forget that the weapon of choice of the United Irishmen was a pike. And they were all made by local the blacksmiths. And that they didn't have until they say the North Cork militia were completely defeated in Owlert Hill, and from that defeat they would have got 100 rifles, maybe a few guns. They armed themselves mostly by weapons taken from defeated Crown forces, who in the most part were Irishmen. I hope that answers your question now.
The reference you made to his daughter Jane being born in Wheelie Barracks in Essex, we found her death afterwards in Coon. She died at about age 30.
Okay, that's very interesting. And does the time frame fit with birth in 1814?
It does, it corresponds.
Very good.
And her name was also Jane.
Okay.
And she's in Castlecomer Church of Ireland death records.
Do you know, I mean, that ties in. That nails it for me then, because to me, up to today, that was an assumption. Now it's a definitive PCR heritage.
Robert's wife was Elizabeth B. Duncan.
Okay. 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 So now, you know, I mean, you're developing. I came in here on a purely military heritage background, and you know, the social history that you have is phenomenal, and it needs to be, you know, expanded. And I can see from all the pictures everywhere that you're doing a good job on it. You know. So.
Okay, I'm sorry we'll have to call it a halt because lunch is ready and there's some children looking for their parents. But one or two small things. We'd just like to say a big hello to Chris, who's watching this in Perth, Cheryl in Sydney, and Emma in Dublin. And finally, just a very big thank you to Larry for coming. And Robin has just a few words, our senior representative from abroad.
Well, I was given the privilege of expressing our deep appreciation to our speaker. I come from the William branch of the Harper tribe, but we're very grateful for a most informative, well-researched, and dedicated study of the fascinating history of the Sergeant Robert. And I've learned a great deal about history that I didn't know before. So with great appreciation, here is a gift of thank you for your presentation and making this a very interesting seminar.
Thank you very much.